Smoke billowed into the night sky as the orange glow of flames consumed the home of Pastor Daniel and his wife, Brianna. Sirens wailed in the distance, their sound piercing the stunned silence of neighbors gathered outside. Daniel emerged from the inferno, his face streaked with soot, cradling a half-burned family photo. His eyes were wild, his breath ragged. He collapsed to his knees, clutching the photo so tightly it crumpled in his hands. "What did you do?" someone yelled, but Daniel didn't respond. Inside, Brianna lay lifeless, consumed by the same flames Daniel had unleashed in a fit of rage. And as the firefighters battled the blaze, the question on everyone's mind was this: what could drive a man of God to commit such a horrific act? Before we unravel this unfortunate occurrence and its complexities, please subscribe to our channel if you believe no one deserves to be betrayed by those they love most, and if you want us to bring you more cases you won't find on Google. From the outside, Pastor Daniel's life seemed perfect. His sermons drew hundreds every Sunday, and his reputation as a devoted husband and father was the envy of the congregation. With their triplet, Micah, Ava, and Jordan, and his loving wife Brianna by his side, Daniel was the embodiment of faith and stability. One Thursday evening, the family gathered for dinner. Brianna had cooked her usual roast chicken, and the kids were their lively selves, laughing and sharing stories from school. But Daniel noticed Brianna was unusually quiet, her eyes darting to the clock every few minutes. "Everything okay, Brianna?" Daniel asked, his tone light but concerned. She hesitated, then forced a smile. "Just tired, that's all." The tension was palpable, but Daniel decided not to press further, at least not in front of the kids. Later that evening, after tucking the children into bed, Daniel approached Brianna in the living room. She sat on the couch, clutching her phone tightly, as though guarding it. "We need to talk," Daniel said, sitting across from her. Brianna's shoulders tensed, but she didn't look up. "About what?" "About whatever it is you're hiding." Her eyes finally met his, a flicker of fear in them. "I don't know what you're talking about." Daniel leaned forward, his voice firm but calm. "Brianna, I've known you for 15 years. I can tell when something's wrong. What's going on?" She opened her mouth to respond, but was interrupted by the sound of the front door opening. Both turned toward the hallway as a voice called out, "Brianna." A woman stepped into view, dressed simply but with an air of quiet confidence. Daniel's brow furrowed in confusion. He didn't recognize her, but Brianna's face went pale. "Tasha, what are you doing here?" Brianna asked, her voice tight. Tasha glanced at Daniel, then back at Brianna. "We need to talk. Now." Daniel stood, his confusion giving way to suspicion. "Who is this?" Before Brianna could respond, Tasha stepped forward. "I'm someone with answers, Pastor, and you deserve to know the truth." Daniel's stomach sank as he looked at Brianna, whose silence spoke louder than any words. The tension in the living room was suffocating. Daniel stood rooted to the spot, his mind racing as he looked between Brianna and the woman who had just introduced herself as Tasha. The way Brianna avoided his gaze confirmed one thing. Whoever Tasha was, she wasn't a stranger to his wife. "Tasha," Daniel said, his tone measured, "I think you owe me an explanation." Tasha's lips tightened. "Pastor, I'm here because I've been looking for my child for years, and now I know where he is." Daniel blinked, confused. "Your child?" "Yes," Tasha said, her voice unwavering. "One of your children. He's mine." Brianna's breath hitched audibly. "Tasha, you can't just—" Tasha raised a hand to silence her, her eyes fixed on Daniel. "No, Brianna, he deserves to know." She turned to Daniel and continued. "I gave birth to a baby boy some years ago. His name was Elijah. I didn't give him up willingly. I was tricked, pressured into signing papers I didn't fully understand. By the time I realized what had happened, it was too late. And now, I've tracked him here." Daniel felt like the floor had dropped from under him. He struggled to process Tasha's words, but her steady gaze and the tremor in her voice made it impossible to dismiss her as a liar. He turned to Brianna, his voice barely above a whisper. "Tell me this isn't true." Brianna's lips trembled, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Daniel, I can explain." "Explain?" Daniel's voice rose, his composure slipping. "Explain how one of our children might belong to this woman." Brianna crumpled onto the couch, her face buried in her hands. Her voice was muffled, but the words hit Daniel like a hammer. "I couldn't have children, Daniel. I lost my womb when I was young. I didn't know how to tell you. I was afraid you'd leave me, so I let my mom help." Daniel staggered back as if physically struck. "Your mother? What does she have to do with this?" Brianna wiped her face, her mascara streaking as she looked up at him. "She arranged it. She knew people who could get us what we needed. I didn't know everything, not at first. But when I held those babies, I thought it didn't matter. They were ours." Daniel's stomach churned. "What about the pregnancy? The delivery? The triplet? Was that all fake, too?" Brianna nodded weakly. "I wore prosthetics. I stayed away from you when it got too obvious. I lied, Daniel. But it was for us. For our family." Daniel's head spun as Tasha stepped forward, her jaw tight. "You lied to yourself, Brianna. You told yourself it didn't matter, but it does. I've spent years looking for my son while you played house with him." She pulled a manila folder from her bag and handed it to Daniel. "Here. DNA results, hospital records, everything you need to know the truth." Daniel hesitated before taking the folder. He opened it, his hands trembling as he scanned the pages. He looked up at Tasha, then at Brianna, who was now sobbing uncontrollably. "You knew this," he said, his voice low and bitter. "You knew, and you lied to me." "I had to," Brianna pleaded. "I couldn't lose you, Daniel. You're everything to me." Daniel clenched the folder in his hand. "Everything to you?" he spat. "Do you even realize what you've done? You didn't just lie to me, you lied to those kids. You built our life on stolen children." Brianna never gave birth to triplets. They were all illegally adopted from different mothers, at once. He turned to Tasha, his voice breaking. "What do you want from us?" Tasha's face softened slightly. "I don't want to take them away. I just want my son back." Daniel stared at her, unable to respond. He felt the walls of his life closing in, the foundation of everything he believed crumbling beneath him. For the first time in his life, Pastor Daniel, devoted husband, father, and man of God, felt utterly powerless. The atmosphere in the house was suffocating. Tasha had left, her departure marked by an icy silence that seemed to stretch forever. Daniel sat in his study, staring at the folder Tasha had given him. Every piece of evidence, the DNA results, the adoption papers, the photographs, felt like a dagger to his faith in the life he thought he had built. Brianna, meanwhile, paced the living room, her breath shallow and her mind racing. She had seen the look in Daniel's eyes as Tasha revealed the truth, betrayal, anger, and something far worse, disbelief. For years she had convinced herself that the lies were justified, but now everything was unraveling and she didn't know how to stop it. Early the next morning, Daniel sat at the kitchen table, sipping coffee that had long gone cold. Brianna entered the room cautiously, her steps hesitant. "We need to talk to the kids," she said softly, her voice hoarse from the previous night's crying. Daniel looked up at her. His face hardened. "The children are going to my sister's for the weekend. They don't need to be part of this right now." Brianna opened her mouth to argue but stopped herself. Deep down, she knew it was for the best. The children didn't need to see the growing rift between their parents or the storm that was about to come. When the kids were packed and dropped off at their aunt's house later that morning, the house felt even emptier. Daniel didn't speak to Brianna on the drive home. He didn't need to. His silence said everything. As the day wore on, Brianna's anxiety grew unbearable. She couldn't shake the feeling that Daniel was slipping away from her, that their marriage, their entire life, was on the verge of collapse. That afternoon she found him in the backyard, sitting on the porch swing. His Bible lay open in his lap, but he wasn't reading it. He stared blankly ahead, his thoughts clearly elsewhere. "Daniel," she said softly, sitting down beside him. "Please talk to me." He didn't respond right away. When he finally turned to her, his expression was a mixture of exhaustion and anger. "I'm trying to understand how you could do this, Brianna. How you could look me in the eye every day and lie." "I didn't have a choice," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I was scared. I was desperate. I knew if I told you the truth, I'd lose you." "You lost me the moment you decided to lie," Daniel shot back, his voice rising. "You didn't even give me the chance to choose. You made that decision for me. For us." As the argument escalated, Daniel's phone buzzed on the porch table. He glanced at the screen. It was Tasha. "What does she want now?" Brianna demanded, panic flashing in her eyes. Daniel ignored her and answered the call. "Tasha?" "I just got a call from the authorities," Tasha said, her tone urgent. "They're opening an investigation into Lila's network. They're going to want to talk to you and Brianna. They already have her name." Daniel's stomach sank. "What does that mean?" "It means things are about to get very complicated," Tasha said grimly. "You need to be ready." After hanging up, Daniel turned to Brianna, who had gone pale. "The authorities are getting involved. Tasha reported everything." Brianna's eyes widened. No, this can't happen. Daniel, they'll destroy us. The kids. What will happen to them? What will people think of us?" Daniel stood abruptly, towering over her. "You should have thought about that before, Brianna. Before you lied to me. Before you dragged our family into this mess." Brianna sank into the swing, her hands clutching the hem of her shirt. She looked up at Daniel with desperation in her eyes. "Please, Daniel. We can fix this. We can figure it out. Together." But Daniel didn't respond. He turned and walked back into the house, leaving Brianna alone on the porch as dark clouds began to gather in the sky. The storm rolled in that night, both outside and inside the Daniels' home. Rain lashed against the windows as thunder rumbled in the distance, but inside, the tension between Daniel and Brianna reached a breaking point. Daniel paced the living room, the weight of the day's revelations pressing down on him like a heavy burden. The folder Tasha had given him lay on the coffee table, its damning evidence spilling out for anyone to see. Brianna sat across from him, her eyes red and swollen from crying, watching him like a cornered animal. "Tell me everything," Daniel demanded, his voice low but firm. Brianna hesitated, her fingers twisting the fabric of her dress. "What do you mean?" "I mean everything," Daniel snapped, his voice rising. "No more half-truths, no more deflection. I want the whole story. Now." Brianna drew in a shaky breath, her hands trembling as she spoke. "It started when we were first married. You wanted kids so badly, but I knew I couldn't give you that. I didn't want you to see me as a failure, Daniel." "You think lying to me made you a success?" Daniel shot back, his tone laced with bitterness. She continued, her voice breaking. "My mother suggested the idea. She said she knew someone who could help, someone who could arrange adoptions without the usual legal complications. At first I refused, but the more I thought about it, the more desperate I became. I just wanted us to be happy." "Happy?" Daniel's voice cracked with anger. "You thought bringing stolen children into our home would make us happy?" "I didn't know they were stolen," Brianna cried. "I thought it was legal, at least at first. But by the time I realized the truth, it was too late. We already had them. They already called me Mom. I couldn't take that away from them, or from you." Daniel sat down heavily on the couch, his head in his hands. "So you let me believe those children were ours. You let me stand up in front of the church, in front of God, and preach about honesty and integrity while our entire life was built on lies. I didn't know what else to do, Brianna whispered, her voice barely audible over the rain pounding against the windows. Daniel looked up at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of anger and despair. You didn't think about the consequences, did you? What happens when the truth comes out? What happens to the kids? To us? Brianna broke into sobs, but Daniel didn't move to comfort her. He couldn't. The betrayal was too fresh, the wound too deep. The storm outside seemed to mirror the turmoil within Daniel's mind. He stood abruptly, pacing the room as his emotions boiled over. His hands clenched into fists at his sides as he glared at Brianna. You've ruined everything, he said, his voice trembling with fury. You've destroyed our family, our reputation, everything I've worked for. I didn't mean for this to happen, Brianna pleaded, her voice cracking. I love you, Daniel. I love our kids. Please, we can fix this. We just need to stick together. But Daniel shook his head, his anger consuming him. No, Brianna. There's no fixing this. There's no coming back from what you've done. He turned and stormed out of the living room, leaving Brianna sobbing on the couch. But instead of heading to bed, Daniel went to the garage. The garage was dark and cold, the rain hammering against the roof. Daniel's mind raced as he stared at the cluttered shelves and tools. He couldn't shake the image of Tasha's face, the pain in her voice as she talked about her stolen child. He couldn't forget the betrayal in Brianna's voice, the lies she had woven so tightly into their lives. As his eyes landed on the red canister of gasoline in the corner, a dangerous thought began to form. His jaw tightened, and his hands trembled as he reached for it. This is the only way, he muttered under his breath, his voice barely audible over the pounding rain. Back in the living room, Brianna had fallen asleep on the couch, exhaustion overtaking her. She didn't stir as Daniel stepped inside, the canister in his hands. He paused, staring at her for a long moment. Memories of their life together flashed through his mind. Their wedding day, the laughter of their children, the sermons they worked on side by side. But all of it felt like a cruel joke now, a mirage built on lies. Daniel took a deep breath, his face hardening. Then, without a word, he began to pour the gasoline. The smell of gasoline filled the air as Daniel poured the contents of the canister across the living room floor. The liquid soaked into the carpet, spreading outward in dark, uneven patterns. Brianna stirred on the couch, mumbling in her sleep, but she didn't wake. Daniel's heart pounded in his chest, his breathing heavy as he moved through the room, dousing the furniture, the curtains, and the base of the staircase. He paused only briefly, the weight of what he was about to do pressing down on him. He thought of his children, safe at his sister's house, and told himself they would be better off without the lies that had poisoned their home. Then he thought of Brianna, her lies, her betrayal, and the destruction she had brought into their lives. His hand trembled as he reached for a box of matches. The faint scratch of a match being struck jolted Brianna awake. Her eyes opened groggily at first, but the pungent smell of gasoline hit her like a slap. She sat up, coughing, and her gaze landed on Daniel, who stood in the middle of the room holding a lit match. "Daniel," she croaked, her voice thick with panic. "What are you doing?" He didn't answer immediately, his eyes locked onto hers, cold and unreadable. "This is the only way," he said finally, his voice low and trembling. Brianna scrambled to her feet, her legs shaky beneath her. "Please, don't do this," she begged, her hands raised in desperation. "We can fix this. We can get through this together." "No, Brianna," Daniel said, shaking his head. "There's no fixing this. You destroyed everything." He dropped the match. The gasoline ignited instantly, flames leaping to life and spreading across the floor with terrifying speed. Brianna screamed, stumbling backward as the fire engulfed the carpet and climbed the furniture. Thick black smoke filled the air, making it hard to see, hard to breathe. "Daniel, stop this!" Brianna cried, her voice hoarse as she coughed violently. But Daniel didn't move. He stood frozen, watching as the fire consumed the room. For a moment he felt a strange sense of relief, as though the flames were erasing the lies and pain that had festered for so long. Then Brianna's screams pulled him back to reality. Brianna tried to run toward the door, but the flames were spreading too quickly, blocking her path. She turned to Daniel, her eyes wide with terror.
"Please, Daniel, don't let me die."
His expression wavered, and for a brief second she thought he might help her. But then his jaw tightened and he turned away, stepping through the smoke toward the front door. "Daniel!" she screamed, her voice cracking as the fire closed in around her. He didn't look back. As Daniel stepped outside, the cold night air hit him like a shock. Neighbors were already gathering on the street, drawn by the thick smoke and flickering orange glow. Sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder with each passing second. Daniel dropped to his knees on the front lawn, his hands shaking as he stared at the inferno consuming his home. Someone grabbed his shoulder, a neighbor shouting something, but the words didn't register. When the fire department arrived moments later, the flames had already gutted most of the house. Firefighters worked furiously to contain the blaze, but it was too late to save Brianna. As the flames died down, the authorities turned their attention to Daniel. His soot-streaked face and hollow eyes told them everything they needed to know. An officer approached Daniel cautiously, his voice firm but calm. "Pastor Daniel, we need to ask you some questions about what happened here tonight." Daniel didn't resist. He didn't say a word as they handcuffed him and led him to a waiting patrol car. The weight of his actions pressed down on him like a crushing force, but in his mind, he justified it as an act of cleansing, a way to purge the lies that had destroyed his family. As the patrol car pulled away, Daniel stared out the window at the smoldering remains of his home. He had thought the fire would bring closure, but all it left was emptiness. The morning after the fire, the neighborhood was eerily quiet. Charred remnants of what once was Pastor Daniel's home now stood as a blackened skeleton. Yellow police tape stretched across the property, fluttering in the breeze as investigators combed through the ashes. Daniel sat in a cold, gray interrogation room at the local police station, his hands cuffed in front of him. His soot-streaked face was expressionless, his eyes fixed on the table. Across from him, Detective Harris flipped through a file, his gaze sharp and unyielding. "Pastor Daniel," Harris began, his voice steady but probing. "You're a man of God, someone people look up to. So tell me, how does a man like that end up burning his own wife alive?" Daniel didn't respond. Harris leaned forward, his tone hardening. "You don't have to speak, but the evidence speaks for itself. Gasoline traces on your clothes, witnesses who saw you walk out of that house while it was on fire. And let's not forget the confession you practically handed us when you didn't even try to deny what you'd done." Daniel finally looked up, his eyes heavy with exhaustion. "You think I wanted this?" he asked, his voice low and rough. "You think I woke up one day and decided to destroy my family? Then why did you do it?" Harris pressed, his pen poised over his notepad. Daniel's jaw clenched, his hands tightening into fists. "You wouldn't understand," he muttered. "Try me," Harris said. For the first time, Daniel's calm exterior cracked. His voice rose thick with anger and pain. "My wife lied to me. For 15 years, she let me believe we had a family, a real family. She let me stand in front of my congregation and preach about truth and faith while everything in my life was a lie." Harris remained silent, letting Daniel's words hang in the air. "She brought stolen children into my house," Daniel continued, his voice breaking. "She let me love them, raise them, believe they were mine. And when it all fell apart, He stopped, his breath hitching as tears welled in his eyes. "You snapped," Harris finished for him. Daniel nodded slowly, his shoulders sagging. "I didn't mean for it to go that far. I just wanted it all to stop." Across town, Tasha sat at her modest kitchen table, speaking softly into a reporter's microphone. The journalist had come seeking her story after hearing rumors of her connection to the Daniels family. "This wasn't just about me," Tasha said, her voice firm, despite the emotion in her eyes. "There are other mothers out there, women who had their children taken by the same network. Lila Daniels orchestrated everything, and Brianna knew exactly what was going on. They lied to everyone, and now people are paying the price." The police investigation quickly uncovered Lila Daniels' illegal adoption network, linking her to multiple cases of coercion and child trafficking. Mothers who had been silenced for years came forward, sharing their stories and exposing the breadth of her operation. Lila fled the state, evading arrest, but her name became synonymous with betrayal and corruption. At Pastor Daniels' church, the congregation struggled to reconcile the truth about their pastor. Some stood by him, insisting that his actions were a result of the unbearable betrayal he faced. Others condemned him, calling him a hypocrite and a murderer. Weeks later, Daniel stood in court, his once pristine suit replaced by a standard orange jumpsuit. The prosecutor painted him as a cold-blooded killer, while his defense attorney argued that he had acted in a moment of emotional and psychological collapse. When the judge read the sentence, life in prison without the possibility of parole, Daniel didn't flinch. He accepted it silently, his head bowed as the weight of his actions settled over him like a shroud. As he was led out of the courtroom, Daniel caught sight of Tasha sitting in the gallery. She didn't say anything, but the look in her eyes spoke volumes. There was no victory here, only loss, pain, and the scars of betrayal. Weeks after the fire, the Daniels children, Micah, Ava, and Jordan, remained at their aunt's house. The once lively home they knew had been reduced to ashes, and with it, the illusion of the perfect family they had grown up in. Though their aunt tried to shield them from the media storm surrounding their father's crime, whispers and news headlines made their way to the children. "Is Dad ever coming back?" Micah asked one night as they sat at the dinner table. Their aunt hesitated, setting down her fork. "I don't know, Micah, but no matter what happens, you're safe here, okay? That's what matters right now." One Saturday morning, Tasha arrived at the aunt's home with a social worker in tow. Micah, Ava, and Jordan peered through the living room window as their aunt greeted the unexpected visitors. "Who's she?" Ava whispered. Micah frowned. I think she's here because of us." Inside, Tasha sat awkwardly on the couch, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She didn't look like the villain the children's aunt had been bracing for. She looked nervous, even hesitant. "I just want to see him," Tasha said quietly, referring to her biological son, Jordan, whom she had named Elijah at birth. The social worker nodded. "We've explained this to the children's guardian, Ms. Daniels. Legally, you have every right to establish contact with Jordan, but we'll proceed at his pace." Jordan entered the room cautiously, his siblings trailing behind him. He stared at Tasha, wide-eyed and unsure. "Hi, Jordan," Tasha said softly, her voice trembling. "I'm Tasha. I'm your biological mom." Jordan blinked, then turned to his aunt for reassurance. His siblings stood protectively beside him, their faces unreadable. The visit was brief, but Tasha's warmth and patience left an impression. She didn't push Jordan for a connection, but offered him space to process what she had said. "You don't have to call me anything you're not comfortable with," she told him, as they sat together in the backyard. "I just wanted to meet you, and I hope someday we can get to know each other." Jordan nodded hesitantly, unsure how to feel. He didn't dislike her, but he didn't fully understand what this meant for his life either. After Tasha left, the children talked quietly in their room. "She seems nice," Ava said. "Yeah, but what does this mean for us?" Micah asked. "Are we supposed to live with her now or stay here? What about Dad?" Jordan, who had been silent the entire time, finally spoke. "I don't want things to change. I just want us to stay together." Their aunt overheard the conversation from the hallway. tears brimming in her eyes. She resolved to do everything in her power to keep the children's bond intact, no matter what the future held. Meanwhile, Pastor Daniel's church grappled with its loss. Congregants who once looked up to Pastor Daniel now faced the painful reality of his actions. Some struggled to reconcile their faith with the betrayal, while others vowed to continue the church's mission despite the scandal. Associate Pastor Gerald, a longtime member of the leadership team, stepped in to lead the congregation during the interim. "We are a community built on faith, and faith is what will see us through this," he said in his first sermon after the fire. But as the weeks passed, attendance dwindled. The church's reputation had been irreparably damaged, and whispers of its former glory began to fade into the background of the community's memory. Tasha continued to visit Jordan under the supervision of the social worker, building a relationship, one small step at a time. Though the path was uncertain, she was determined to provide him with a sense of truth and stability, a life free from the lies that had overshadowed his early years. As for Micah and Ava, they clung tightly to each other and to their aunt, finding comfort in the one thing that had remained constant, their sibling bond. And Daniel? He sat alone in a prison cell, the distant sound of clanging metal echoing around him. Each day, he replayed the choices he had made, the lies he had believed, the rage that had consumed him, and the destruction he had unleashed. In the end, he was left with nothing but the weight of his guilt and the hollow echo of a life burned to ashes. Betrayal, lies, and rage can tear even the strongest families apart. Stories like this remind us how dangerous hidden truths can be. Subscribe now for more gripping narratives that uncover the darkest corners of the human heart.